Thanksgiving is supposed to be a time for family, laughter, and good food shared around a warm table. This year, it felt even more special. Two sides of the family meeting for the first time in years, reconnecting over a festive meal. The house buzzed with energy. My parents were in the kitchen, juggling roasting pans and simmering pots. My partner and I flitted between tasks, arranging place settings, picking the right playlist, making sure everything looked just right. A newborn baby, the first in the family for years, was asleep in the corner, providing a rare moment of stillness in the chaos. Amid all the bustle, my sister, 22 years old and notoriously unpredictable, was upstairs. She hadn't emerged from her room all morning, which wasn't exactly unusual. Around 1 p.m., I went up to check on her, knocking gently on the door. "Hey, just a heads up. Guests are coming at 7. Can you make sure to get ready by then?" She mumbled something vague through the door, and I took it as confirmation. After all, it wasn't an unreasonable request. Downstairs, the hours flew by as the preparations intensified. The dining table gleamed with polished silverware and sparkling glasses. The smells of freshly baked bread and roasted turkey filled the air. Every now and then, someone would ask, "Where's your sister?" And I'd assure them she'd be down soon. At that moment, I truly believed she would. Thanksgiving, for me, has always been about everyone coming together, no matter how hectic life gets. It felt important, almost sacred, to have everyone seated at the table. So, as the clock ticked closer to dinner, I assumed she'd sense the occasion's importance and join us on time. It never crossed my mind that this might not happen. At 1 p.m., the atmosphere was still light. We were all busy, but the kind of busy that feels purposeful, even fun. As I knocked on my sister's door that first time, I wasn't worried. I could hear movement inside, music playing faintly, the occasional shuffle of feet. It seemed like she was in her own little world, as usual. When I called out, "Hey, guests are coming at 7. Just wanted to make sure you're good to get ready by then," her response was muffled but nonchalant. "Yeah, okay," she said, and I took her word for it. Back downstairs, the hours slipped by in a blur of chopping vegetables, setting up folding chairs, and fielding last-minute texts from family members confirming arrival times. The turkey was browning beautifully in the oven, and the cranberry sauce had just the right balance of sweet and tart. Every now and then, I'd glance at the clock and think, plenty of time. By 3 p.m., someone asked, "Is she helping with anything?" I shrugged it off with a casual, "She'll be down soon." I wasn't worried yet, but I figured it wouldn't hurt to check in again. Another knock, another muffled response. "Don't forget 7 o'clock, I reminded her. "Plenty of time," she called back almost cheerfully. It wasn't out of character for her to stay in her room for long stretches. She's always been the type to need her space, especially in a busy household like ours. But as the day wore on, I started to notice her absence a bit more. We all did. Even though it didn't feel like a big deal yet, the nagging thought crept in. I hope she doesn't cut it too close. Still, I reassured myself, it's just her way. As the afternoon rolled on, the rhythm of preparation picked up pace. The kitchen transformed into a controlled chaos of clinking pans, sizzling pots, and snippets of conversation that overlapped like a symphony. Guests were texting updates, who was running late, who'd bring an extra dessert, and the house felt alive with anticipation. Amid it all, my sister's absence became harder to ignore. Around 4 p.m., I knocked on her door again. This time, there was a pause before she answered, her tone slightly sharper. I know. 7 o'clock, she said, cutting me off before I could remind her. I tried not to read too much into it. Maybe she was just tired, or maybe the usual sibling friction was creeping in. Still, I couldn't help but wonder why she hadn't come out yet, not even for a quick snack or to ask how things were going. By 5 p.m., the house was a hive of activity. The turkey was resting, mashed potatoes were being whipped, and I was dashing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen, checking on last-minute details. The table, now fully set, was a vision of holiday tradition. Candles flickering, plates meticulously arranged, and name cards resting neatly at each spot. Everything was ready, except her. I knocked one more time, a little more firmly. "Just making sure you're still on track," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You've got 2 hours now." There was no response at first. Then, faintly, "Got it." Her continued silence started to feel like static in the background, a subtle tension beneath the surface of an otherwise joyful day. I tried to push it out of my mind. There were so many other things demanding my attention: guests arriving, food timing, and ensuring everyone felt welcomed. But as the minutes ticked closer to 7, I couldn't shake the thought, what if she doesn't show up on time at all? By 7 p.m., the house was buzzing with life. The first guests arrived right on time, arms full of wine bottles and pie tins. Hugs and laughter filled the entryway as coats were draped over chairs and shoes shuffled off in the foyer. It felt good to see everyone together again after so long. Family members who hadn't been in the same room for years were finally reunited. The air was filled with the kind of chatter that only happens during holidays, catching up on life, exchanging stories, and marveling at how much the baby had grown. Amid the warmth and chaos, I couldn't help but glance at the stairs. My sister's door remained firmly shut. I thought about knocking again, but decided against it. After all, I'd reminded her enough times throughout the day. She knew what time dinner was, and it wasn't as if she hadn't had ample warning. In the kitchen, the final preparations were underway. My mom and dad were putting the finishing touches on the dishes while I shuffled platters from the stove to the table. The turkey sat at the center, golden and steaming, surrounded by bowls of stuffing, green beans, and sweet potatoes. It was a picture-perfect Thanksgiving spread. As more guests trickled in, I found myself fielding subtle questions. "Where's your sister?" someone asked, glancing toward the stairs. "She'll be down soon," I said, my smile faltering just slightly. I wasn't sure anymore. The newborn, still miraculously asleep in her carrier, was passed around gently between relatives, drawing smiles and coos. People began taking their seats, filling the dining room with lively conversation. The mood was light, but I could feel a small knot of tension forming in my chest. It wasn't just about her absence. It was about what it might mean. By 7:30, everyone was seated, napkins unfolded, glasses poured. Still no sign of her. The murmurs grew quieter as the question became unspoken. Do we wait, or do we start? By 7:45, the mood at the table had shifted slightly. The chatter was still lively, but there was an undercurrent of hesitation. Plates sat empty, silverware untouched, and eyes flickered toward the kitchen door where the food was waiting. I could see my mom glancing at the clock, her usual calm demeanor just starting to crack under the weight of the unspoken question, "What do we do now?" I stood in the hallway just outside her door, phone in hand, sending her yet another message. "Dinner's ready. Everyone's seated. Please come down." I knocked firmly this time. "We're about to eat," I called out, my voice carefully neutral but louder than before. The silence that followed felt heavy. My patience, which had lasted all day, was starting to fray. Back in the dining room, the guests were doing their best to keep things light. My uncle cracked a joke about turkeys taking their time to cool, earning a few polite laughs. Someone passed around an appetizer plate of olives and cheese that had been meant for earlier. But I could tell that people were hungry, and the newborn baby, still blissfully asleep, offered a small but real deadline. If we waited too long, that peaceful nap could end at any moment, and chaos would take its place. At 8 hours, my dad gave me a look across the table. It wasn't angry, but it was firm. He was ready to start. I nodded, signaling my quiet agreement. "All right," my mom finally said, standing up to bring the first dish to the table. "Let's eat." The clatter of serving spoons broke the tension as people began helping themselves. I wanted to feel relief, but all I could think about was my sister, still upstairs. As the first plates were filled and passed around, I sent her one last text. "We've started eating. Please come down." At 8:24 p.m., we took our first bites. The table was a swirl of motion, plates being passed, gravy ladled, glasses clinking. The food was perfect, the kind of Thanksgiving feast you look forward to all year. But there was an undeniable weight hanging over the room, one that none of us could completely ignore. My sister's absence lingered like an uninvited guest, shadowing what should have been a moment of celebration. I couldn't help glancing at the stairs, half expecting to see her coming down, maybe still brushing her hair or tying her sweater. But the hallway remained empty. The voices around me rose and fell, conversations flowing naturally as people caught up on work, kids, and life. It was the first time in years that both sides of the family had been together, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the warmth of it. The joy of seeing cousins laugh, my uncle sharing a story that had everyone grinning. Still, I kept checking my phone, hoping for a response to the messages I'd sent. Nothing. Each minute that passed made it harder to justify her absence. The table had filled every seat except one, and her empty chair seemed to draw more attention than the turkey in the center. I tried to focus on the meal, complimenting the stuffing and passing the cranberry sauce to whoever needed it. But guilt crept in alongside the frustration. We hadn't wanted it to come to this, starting without her. Yet with 11 people at the table, including a baby who miraculously still slept, waiting any longer just hadn't been an option. As I poured myself a glass of wine, I pushed down the gnawing question: had we made the right choice? Barely 10 minutes had passed since we started eating when I heard the sound of her door opening. The soft creak of the hinges and the faint thud of her footsteps descending the stairs made everyone pause, even if only for a second. The clinking of utensils quieted just slightly, and a few heads turned toward the doorway. She appeared in the dining room with an expression that was unmistakably annoyed, her eyebrows furrowed, arms crossed over her chest. "Seriously? You started without me?" she said, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. There was no attempt to mask her frustration, and her tone carried the weight of a personal offense. I glanced around the table, gauging everyone's reactions. Most people looked surprised, some uncomfortable. My dad shifted in his chair, clearly debating whether to say something. My mom offered a tentative, "We waited as long as we could, sweetie." Her gaze shifted to me, sharp and accusatory. "You could have told me you were starting," she said, as if the messages I had sent, reminders, warnings, and updates, had never existed. My stomach tightened, a mix of guilt and frustration bubbling up. I wanted to respond, to lay out the timeline and the effort we'd put into including her. But the dinner table didn't feel like the place for that. Instead, I took a deep breath and gestured to the empty chair. "Your plate's ready," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Join us." She huffed but slid into her seat, the tension radiating off her in waves. The table tried to recover its rhythm, with someone offering her a dish of mashed potatoes and another chiming in with a lighthearted remark. But her mood lingered, casting a shadow over the warmth we'd built. As the conversations resumed, I could feel her glances toward me, as if silently demanding an explanation. But what could I say that wouldn't make things worse? For now, I focused on eating, hoping the food might ease the edges of an already strained evening. Her arrival had shifted the atmosphere, and not in the way anyone hoped. Though the table resumed its lively hum of conversation, it was clear that the undercurrent of tension hadn't dissipated. Her frustration was palpable, and even as she served herself a plate of food, her movements were stiff and deliberate. A silent protest against what she clearly felt was an injustice. I avoided her gaze, focusing instead on a story my uncle was telling about a recent fishing trip. The room erupted in laughter, but I noticed my sister barely cracked a smile. Instead, she sat quietly, poking at her food, occasionally glancing toward me or our parents as if daring someone to address the elephant in the room. The thing is, nobody wanted to. Thanksgiving had been chaotic enough already, balancing a newborn's nap schedule, coordinating dishes between two families, and navigating the usual holiday stress. A confrontation at the table was the last thing anyone wanted. Still, I couldn't shake the weight of her earlier words. "You could have told me you were starting, hadn't I?" I mentally replayed the day, knocking on her door, texting updates, trying to ensure she felt included despite her lack of response. I'd done everything short of dragging her downstairs myself, and yet her frustration made me question if we'd handled things as well as we could have. Maybe we should have waited longer. Maybe I should have knocked one last time before we sat down. The questions nagged at me, distracting me from the joy I'd felt earlier. Meanwhile, my mom was doing her best to bridge the gap, gently asking my sister how her day had been and whether she liked the stuffing. My sister answered in clipped sentences, her tone neutral but unmistakably detached. It was as if she were present only in body, not in spirit. By the time dessert was served, the tension had become a quiet, unspoken conflict. The pumpkin pie was delicious, the coffee warm and comforting, but it all felt a little dulled, overshadowed by the rift that no one seemed ready to address. As dessert plates emptied and the conversation naturally tapered off, the room began to settle. People leaned back in their chairs, sipping coffee or tea, their voices softer now, tinged with the kind of contentment that follows a big meal. My sister, however, remained stiff, her fork scraping the remnants of her pie with deliberate slowness. It was clear she was still simmering, and the unresolved tension hung in the air like a faint but persistent hum. I avoided looking directly at her, focusing instead on clearing plates and tidying up around the table. My mom and dad joined in, grateful, I think, for the distraction of the cleanup. Some of the guests had started gathering in the living room, drawn to the warmth of the fireplace and the promise of more relaxed conversations away from the dining table. The baby had woken up by then, her soft coos adding a gentle backdrop to the otherwise quiet house. When I finally caught my sister's eye, her expression was a mix of annoyance and disappointment. She didn't say anything, but the message was clear. This wasn't over. I felt a pang of frustration. It was hard not to feel like we'd been put in a no-win situation. Starting without her had felt like the only reasonable choice at the time, yet here we were, paying for it in an unspoken but undeniable way. As the guests drifted further into the living room, I lingered near the kitchen, half waiting for her to say something, to give me an opening to explain or apologize. But she stayed silent, clearing her plate with the same deliberate energy she'd carried all evening. The weight of the moment felt almost unbearable, and yet neither of us seemed willing to be the first to speak. As the night wore on, I found myself retreating into the kitchen under the guise of tidying up. The rhythm of rinsing dishes and loading the dishwasher gave me something to focus on, a way to process the guilt and frustration that had built up since dinner began. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the living room, where laughter and conversation carried on as if nothing had happened. My sister, however, remained noticeably absent, her chair in the corner conspicuously empty. The truth was, I couldn't stop replaying the day in my mind. Had we made the wrong choice? I thought about all the warnings and reminders we'd given her, the knocks on her door, the texts, the constant updates about the timeline. It wasn't as though we hadn't tried to include her, but starting dinner without her still felt like a failure. Like we'd let the situation spiral out of control instead of finding a better solution. The part that stung most was the look she'd given me when she finally came downstairs. It wasn't just annoyance. It was hurt. She hadn't said it outright, but her expression was clear. She felt excluded. And no matter how much I justified our decision in my head, that feeling of exclusion was hard to dismiss. As I scrubbed the last roasting pan, my mom came into the kitchen, carrying a tray of empty coffee cups. She gave me a small, knowing smile. "You did your best," she said, her voice quiet, but firm. I nodded, not entirely convinced. "She'll come around," my mom added, setting the tray on the counter, but the knot in my chest didn't loosen. By the time I rejoined the others in the living room, my sister was still nowhere to be found. I tried to join the conversation, to laugh along with the stories being shared, but the lingering guilt sat heavy in my stomach, a reminder that the day hadn't gone the way I'd hoped. As the night settled into its quieter phase, the living room had become a cocoon of comfort. People lounged on the couches, sipping from half-full mugs of coffee or nibbling on leftover pie. The baby, now fully awake, was passed from lap to lap, eliciting soft chuckles and coos with every yawn and stretch. It was the kind of scene I'd normally sink into without hesitation, a moment to relax after the chaos of hosting. But tonight, I felt like an observer on the outskirts. My sister's absence loomed larger now. She hadn't rejoined the group after dinner, and though no one had said it outright, I could tell people noticed. A few family members had quietly asked about her. "Is she okay?" She seems upset, but I didn't have a satisfying answer to give. She's just tired, I'd said. Or, she needed a moment, brushing it off with the hope that they wouldn't press further. Deep down, I knew she probably felt humiliated, angry, or both. And while I wanted to explain everything from my perspective, to lay out the chaos of the day, the constant reminders, the impossible balance of guests and timing, I also knew it wouldn't erase how she felt. No amount of justification could undo her sense of being left out, even if it had never been intentional. Around 10 p.m., my dad made his way to the kitchen, carrying a plate of pie wrapped in foil. "I'm going to take this up to her," he said, his voice low so as not to draw attention. I nodded, grateful that someone was making the first move, but also relieved it wasn't me. My energy for confrontation, or even reconciliation, felt completely drained. As he disappeared up the stairs, I tried to refocus on the room around me. People were sharing stories, laughing, reconnecting in the way I'd hoped the evening would go. For a few moments, I managed to smile and even laugh, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't stop wondering what was happening upstairs, and whether this rift would linger long after Thanksgiving was over. From my seat in the living room, I could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from upstairs. My dad's tone was calm, steady, the same voice he used when trying to diffuse situations without escalating them. My sister's replies, though muffled, carried an edge, short and clipped, her frustration still clear even through the walls. I tried not to listen too closely, but it was impossible not to tune in, waiting for a shift in tone that might signal progress or, at the very least, a truce. Downstairs, the atmosphere remained warm and relaxed. My mom was chatting with an aunt about old family recipes, the baby was back in her carrier, and someone had turned on soft holiday music in the background. It all felt so normal, yet my focus kept drifting back to the unresolved tension upstairs. My stomach churned with the mix of guilt and anticipation that comes when you know a conversation could go either way. After what felt like forever, though it was probably only 10 minutes, my dad returned to the living room. He walked in casually, as if nothing was out of the ordinary, and rejoined the conversation without offering any details. I wanted to ask him what they had talked about, if things were okay, but I held back. If he wanted to share, he would. Instead, I kept quiet and tried to gauge from his demeanor whether any progress had been made. He didn't seem upset, at least, which was a small relief. My sister, however, didn't come down. The empty chair in the corner of the room felt heavier now, its presence a quiet reminder that not everything had been resolved. I told myself it was a step. At least a conversation had happened. Maybe it was enough to begin repairing the moment. But part of me wondered if this Thanksgiving would always be remembered for the tension that split it in two. For now, though, I focused on making the rest of the evening feel as whole as possible for everyone still in the room. As the evening wound down, I found myself replaying the snippets of conversation I'd overheard from upstairs, trying to piece together my sister's side of the story. I knew she was upset, but I hadn't fully grasped what she must have been feeling throughout the day. For her, the timeline probably felt different, less urgent, more flexible. Perhaps the reminders had come across as nagging, as if we were treating her like a child who couldn't manage her time. I thought about how the day might have unfolded from her perspective, waking up, knowing she had until 7 p.m., and perhaps losing track of time in the comfort of her own space. Maybe she assumed we wouldn't actually start without her, that family gatherings always run a little late, and she'd still have time to join. When she finally came down and saw everyone seated, mid-bite, it must have felt like a slap in the face, like we'd prioritized the schedule over her presence. The more I considered it, the more I understood why she reacted the way she did. She's always been sensitive to feeling excluded, and in a family as close-knit as ours, being left out, intentional or not, cuts deep. That empty chair at the table wasn't just a seat. To her, it was a statement. No matter how much we justified it as a practical decision, it didn't change how it looked from her side, her family sitting down together without her. It didn't make me feel less frustrated about the day's events, but it gave me a sliver of empathy. Her silence wasn't just stubbornness, it was hurt. And while I still felt we'd done what we had to in the moment, I couldn't ignore the role her emotions played in shaping the evening. It wasn't just about being late. It was about feeling forgotten. As the night unfolded, I couldn't help but notice how the guests were navigating the underlying tension. Family dynamics are rarely subtle, and even though no one outright mentioned my sister's absence, or the quiet edge her arrival had brought to the table, it was clear they had noticed. Their reactions were a mix of polite avoidance and thinly veiled curiosity, the kind you'd expect when people are trying not to take sides. Some leaned into the festive atmosphere, doubling down on cheerful anecdotes and hearty laughs, as though sheer enthusiasm might smooth over the awkwardness. My uncle, always the entertainer, kept the conversation lively, pulling the attention away from the empty chair in the living room. Meanwhile, a few others exchanged quiet, knowing glances, their questions implied but unspoken. At one point, an aunt approached me in the kitchen while I was refilling the coffee pot. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly, her tone concerned but not prying. I offered a quick smile and a vague reassurance. "Yeah, she's just having a tough day." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. It was easier to downplay the situation than to unravel the complexities of the day's events. What struck me most was how effortlessly everyone shifted to maintain the evening's tone. It wasn't that they didn't care about my sister or what had happened. They simply understood the importance of keeping the focus on the bigger picture. This was the first time in years that both sides of the family were under one roof, and no one wanted the day to be overshadowed by tension. Still, their subtle efforts to maintain normalcy only highlighted the divide that had formed. Even as the laughter and stories filled the room, the weight of what had happened lingered just beneath the surface. As the last guests prepared to leave, the house slowly quieted. The warm energy that had filled the rooms earlier in the day had softened, giving way to the gentle hum of goodbyes and the rustling of coats being gathered. I stood by the door, hugging family members and exchanging polite promises to do this again soon, though I wasn't sure if anyone truly believed it would happen. Holiday reunions always seemed to be bittersweet, wonderful in the moment, but fragile. When the door finally closed behind the last guest, the house felt almost too quiet. The baby, now back in her carrier, let out a small cry, breaking the stillness for just a moment before settling again. My parents busied themselves in the kitchen, tidying the last remnants of the evening. My dad, who had gone upstairs earlier to speak with my sister, offered me a small nod as he passed by, a quiet assurance that things were, at least for now, calm. I sat on the couch, staring at the now empty dining table. The plates and glasses had been cleared, but the impressions of the night lingered. The laughter, the conversations, and, of course, the tension. My mind wandered to my sister, still upstairs, and I wondered what she was thinking. Was she regretting the way the day had gone? Or was she still sitting in her own hurt, unable to let it go? The guilt from earlier hadn't left me, but now it felt more like a quiet ache than a sharp pang. I thought about how much effort had gone into the day, how everyone had come together to make it special. Yet one piece of the puzzle had been missing. It didn't feel like failure exactly, but it wasn't the success I'd envisioned either. As I sat there, I realized something. The day's events weren't about who was right or wrong. They were about the small cracks in relationships, the misunderstandings that can fester when left unspoken. Thanksgiving was over, but the work of piecing things back together had only just begun. For now, though, all I could do was let the day end. As I sat in the quiet of the living room, reflecting on the day, I began to consider how much of what had happened was rooted in our family's dynamics. Every family has its patterns, its quirks, and its invisible threads that tie people together, or pull them apart. Ours was no different. My sister and I had always been opposites in many ways. While I leaned toward organization and predictability, she thrived in spontaneity, often at the expense of structure. This wasn't new. It had been a source of friction between us for years. But today, it had played out on a bigger stage, with an audience of family and expectations that neither of us had fully acknowledged. The way the day had unfolded felt like a magnifying glass over those differences. My attempts to keep her on schedule, though well-intentioned, may have felt controlling to her. Meanwhile, her late arrival and apparent lack of urgency felt, to me, like a disregard for the effort we'd all put into the day. It wasn't just about Thanksgiving. It was about how we saw each other, how our roles in the family had shaped our relationship. I thought about the tension at the table, the way it seemed to ripple outward even as everyone tried to focus on the food and conversation. It wasn't just her absence that had been noticed. It was what it represented. Family gatherings have a way of highlighting the dynamics we don't always address. The unspoken expectations, the lingering resentments, and the small moments of connection or disconnection that define us. As I got up to help my parents finish cleaning, I realized that today's conflict wasn't an isolated event. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that would take more than one conversation or one holiday to truly resolve. In the middle of all the tension and reflection, there was one thing that brought an undeniable sense of peace. The baby, her tiny coos, her soft breathing, and the way she nestled against whichever relative was holding her seemed to create a bubble of calm wherever she was. She had no idea about the dynamics unfolding around her, no awareness of the invisible lines of conflict that had drawn and redrawn themselves throughout the day. She simply existed, blissfully untouched by the complexities of family life. At one point, as I sat on the couch, my mom handed her to me. Her warmth against my chest felt grounding, her weight light yet reassuring. She opened her eyes briefly, a flash of curiosity before closing them again, perfectly content. It struck me how something so small could bring such a profound sense of perspective. The baby's presence had been a unifying thread throughout the day. Earlier, during the meal, relatives had passed her around like a precious gift, their faces lighting up with every little movement she made. Even now, in the quiet aftermath, she remained a symbol of hope, a reminder of why we came together in the first place. Family is messy, unpredictable, and often frustrating, but moments like this made it clear that it was worth it. The baby represented a fresh start, a future untainted by the grudges or misunderstandings that weighed us down. Holding her, I felt a flicker of optimism. Maybe the fractures in our family weren't as permanent as they seemed. Maybe, with time and effort, they could heal. As she let out a tiny yawn, I smiled for the first time in what felt like hours. The evening wasn't perfect, but in her quiet presence, it was easy to believe that perfection wasn't the goal. Connection was. Despite the baby's soothing presence, the tension in the house hadn't fully dissipated. It was quieter now, less overt, but it lingered in the way conversations trailed off and in the silence that seemed to stretch a little too long in between. My parents moved about the kitchen, finishing up the last of the cleanup, their exchanges curt but not unkind. Just the kind of clipped communication that comes when everyone's a little too tired to deal with emotions. My sister, still upstairs, hadn't rejoined us. I couldn't tell if it was a deliberate choice to avoid confrontation or just a desire to be alone after the day's events. Either way, her absence felt heavy, like an unacknowledged void that no one wanted to address. At one point, my mom sighed deeply, the kind of sigh that says more than words. "She's always been like this," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else, as she dried a dish. I didn't respond. I wasn't sure if I agreed or if I was just too drained to continue the conversation. In the living room, the remaining family members were subdued. The earlier laughter had dwindled, replaced by softer voices and the occasional clink of a coffee cup being set down. Even the baby, now sleeping again, seemed to mirror the mood. It wasn't awkward exactly, but it wasn't the warm, glowing ending to the evening that I'd hoped for either. As I sat there, I wondered how the night would have played out differently if things had gone smoother. Would we all still be sitting here, laughing and reminiscing, the baby's tiny snores blending seamlessly into the background? Or would there have been some other bump in the road, some other flare of tension that reminded us of the imperfections in our family dynamic? For now, though, the night wasn't over. It was simply settling. The tension lingered like the smell of turkey in the air. Not entirely unpleasant, but impossible to ignore. It felt like a reminder that holidays are never as picture-perfect as we imagine, but maybe that's okay. Maybe they're just as messy and human as the people who gather for them. As the evening wound down, the house took on an air of hushed intimacy. People spoke in quieter tones, and footsteps seemed softer against the creaking wood floors. Upstairs, my sister remained tucked away, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was replaying the day in her head as much as I had been. Meanwhile, downstairs, the guests who lingered began having quieter, more personal conversations in the corners of the living room or near the fireplace. At one point, I overheard my mom speaking with one of my aunts in the kitchen. Their voices were low, but the words carried through the open doorway. "She always feels like we're against her," my mom said, the weight of years of unresolved tension clear in her tone. "I don't know how to reach her sometimes." "She's young," my aunt replied. "She'll figure it out. These things take time." Their exchange was brief, but it struck a chord. My sister's frustration wasn't just about the day. It was part of a larger story, one that I'd only started to understand. The patterns we fall into as a family, the roles we assume without thinking, the ways we fail to communicate. It all builds up, year after year, until a single missed dinner can feel like proof of something much bigger. Later, as I stood by the stairs, I heard my dad's voice from behind my sister's door. He must have gone up again, this time with a gentler approach. Though I couldn't make out the words, his tone was softer, more conciliatory. I hoped he was making progress, that they were finding some middle ground. Downstairs, the rest of the family carried on as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the conversations happening in these quieter moments. They were the real heart of the evening, the spaces where understanding might start to grow. As I sat in the quiet of the living room, I found myself thinking about the delicate balancing act that Thanksgiving had become. Hosting a holiday dinner is never just about the food or the decor. It's about managing expectations. Everyone comes into the day with their own hopes, their own assumptions about how things should unfold, and it's impossible to meet them all. Today had been a stark reminder of that. For me, the expectation was simple: togetherness. I had envisioned everyone gathered around the table, sharing stories and laughter, a seamless blend of family and food. My sister, I realized, likely had a different perspective. Maybe she had expected the day to unfold at its usual unhurried pace, giving her the time and space she needed to feel ready. Neither of us had been entirely wrong, but neither of us had truly considered the other's point of view. Then there were the guests. Some had likely expected a picture-perfect evening, while others may have come prepared for the inevitable chaos that large family gatherings bring. My parents, ever the mediators, had done their best to smooth over any rough edges, but even their patience had its limits. The weight of trying to please everyone had been exhausting, and in the end, I wasn't sure we'd succeeded. The evening had been a mix of joy and tension, connection and disconnection. Yet, as imperfect as it was, it hadn't been a failure. It was just real, a reflection of what it means to bring people together, each with their own histories and emotions. As I watched the last of the coffee cups being collected and heard the low hum of conversation still lingering, I realized that holidays aren't about perfect balance. They're about showing up, messy feelings and all, and doing your best to make it work. As the clock crept closer to midnight, the energy in the house shifted into its final phase. The few remaining guests settled deeper into their seats, voices growing softer, conversations meandering into quieter, more reflective topics. My parents, still bustling about in the kitchen, finally allowed themselves to relax, their movements slower now, the tension from earlier easing into tired relief. I moved from the living room to the dining room, clearing away the last few glasses and napkins left behind. The table, once so carefully set and full of life, now sat empty and quiet, lit only by the soft glow of a candle that hadn't yet burned out. I paused for a moment, running my hand along the edge of the table, letting the stillness settle over me. My sister's absence was still palpable, but the urgency of it had faded. She hadn't come back down, and I had stopped expecting her to. Instead, I found myself focusing on the people who were still here, their laughter now softer, but no less genuine. My uncle was sharing one last story, his hands gesturing animatedly as he recounted an old family memory, drawing chuckles from those gathered around him. In the kitchen, my mom leaned against the counter, sipping a cup of tea. She caught my eye and gave me a small smile, the kind that spoke of shared understanding without the need for words. She looked tired but content, the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you did your best, even if the day hadn't gone perfectly. As I carried the last tray of dishes into the kitchen, I heard the faint creak of the stairs. My heart skipped slightly, wondering if it might be my sister, but it was just my dad, heading back down after checking in on her one last time. He joined my mom by the counter, their voices low as they exchanged a few words, before falling into companionable silence. The night wasn't perfect, but it was ending as peacefully as it could. Sometimes, that was enough. As the house quieted further, I found myself sitting in the kitchen, the warmth of a cup of tea between my hands. My parents had retreated to the living room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. The tension of the evening felt like it had finally begun to settle, but there was still a nagging feeling that something remained unresolved. After a moment of hesitation, I stood and made my way upstairs. Her door was slightly ajar, and I knocked gently before stepping in. My sister was sitting on her bed, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by its glow. She glanced up, her expression neutral, but not hostile. "Hey," I said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "Can we talk?" She set her phone aside and nodded, her posture shifting slightly, as though she'd been waiting for this. I sat down on the edge of the bed, unsure of how to begin. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," I said finally. "Sorry if you felt like we left you out or didn't wait long enough. It wasn't what I wanted to happen." She sighed, her shoulders relaxing a little. "I get it," she said after a moment. "I wasn't ready, but it still hurt to come down and see everyone eating without me." "I know," I replied, my voice quieter now. "We didn't want to start without you, but things got chaotic and I don't know. Maybe we should have waited." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling between us. "It's not just about tonight," she admitted. "Sometimes it feels like I'm always the last priority." Her words stung, but they also made sense. I nodded slowly, realizing that this conversation was about more than Thanksgiving. It was a start. The next morning, as I sat at the kitchen table sipping coffee, the quiet of the house gave me space to reflect. My sister and I had exchanged a few words before bed. Not a full resolution, but enough to feel like we'd broken through some of the tension. Still, her words about feeling like a low priority lingered in my mind. It was a perspective I hadn't fully considered, and it stung to realize how often I might have overlooked her feelings in moments like these. Over the course of the day, family members began sharing their own reflections on the previous night. My mom, always trying to smooth things over, mentioned how hard it is to please everyone at these gatherings. "There's always something," she said with a tired laugh as she wiped down the kitchen counters. "But we did the best we could, and that's all that matters." My dad, ever practical, had a slightly different take. "She'll get over it," he said with a shrug when I brought up my sister. "We've all had moments like that at family dinners. She'll learn to roll with it." My uncle, overhearing us, chimed in with a more nuanced perspective. "Family gatherings are tough because everyone comes with their own expectations. It's like we all show up with our little emotional baggage, and sometimes it just doesn't fit together." He smiled wryly. "But that's what makes us family, right? We're stuck figuring it out." Their comments, while well-meaning, reminded me how differently everyone experiences the same event. For some, Thanksgiving had been a wonderful reunion, full of laughter and connection. For my sister, it had been a moment of feeling left out and unseen. For me, it had been a mix of joy and guilt, of celebrating the good while grappling with the not-so-good. Hearing their perspectives helped me realize that no single person's view of the night could define it entirely. It had been messy, imperfect, and emotional, but that's what family gatherings are. The key was to learn from it, to take what we could and move forward, knowing that next time, we'd try to do better. The day after Thanksgiving carried an air of calm and subtle introspection. The house, now quiet and tidy, felt like a completely different space from the lively chaos of the day before. As I sat at the dining table with my second cup of coffee, I found myself replaying the events of the previous evening. With a clearer head, I could finally start to untangle the knot of emotions that had built up over the day. There was a part of me that still felt justified in the decisions we'd made. The timeline had been chaotic, and with so many people to feed and entertain, waiting much longer simply hadn't felt like an option. But there was another part of me, one I couldn't ignore, that kept coming back to my sister's feelings. Her words from our late-night conversation echoed in my mind. "It's not just about tonight." I began to see the day not just as a single event, but as part of a larger pattern. My sister's lateness had frustrated me, but how often had I really tried to understand her perspective? How many times had I assumed she'd just figure it out, or brushed off her silence as stubbornness without looking deeper? The truth was, Thanksgiving had simply brought to the surface tensions that had been building for years. I glanced at the empty chair where she'd sat the night before, and felt a pang of regret. Not just for starting dinner without her, but for the years of moments like this that had gone unaddressed. The family had carried on, as families do, but maybe it was time to stop glossing over the cracks in our relationships. As I finished my coffee, I resolved to try harder, not just to keep the peace during holidays, but to truly understand and connect with her, even in the small, ordinary moments that come in between. As the weekend unfolded, I kept coming back to the idea of communication. How much of what had gone wrong on Thanksgiving boiled down to things left unsaid or misunderstood. It wasn't just about the reminders I'd given my sister or the messages she didn't respond to. It was about the gaps in how we talked to each other, the assumptions we made without ever checking if they were true. Throughout the day, I replayed moments from the past where we'd stumbled in the same way. The small misunderstandings that grew into bigger frustrations, the times I'd let my annoyance build instead of addressing it head-on. My sister wasn't blameless, but neither was I. We had fallen into a pattern of talking past each other rather than to each other. Sitting down with my mom later in the afternoon, I brought up the topic. "Do you think we could have handled things differently?" I asked, knowing full well the answer, but wanting her perspective. She sighed, stirring a mug of tea. "We all could have done things better," she said. "But that's the thing about family. You're never perfect. You just try to be better the next time." Her words struck a chord. I realized that what had felt like an insurmountable conflict at the time was actually something we could learn from. If I wanted things to change, it would take more than hoping my sister would see things my way. It would take effort on my part to understand her perspective and communicate mine in a way that didn't feel like a demand or an accusation. Later that evening, I decided to text her. It wasn't a long message, just a simple acknowledgement. "Hey, I've been thinking about what you said. I'm sorry if I've made you feel like a low priority. I want to do better." Her reply came quickly. "Thanks. Me too." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And maybe, with better communication, we could turn Thanksgiving into less of a battleground and more of what it was supposed to be, a time to connect. As the weekend drew to a close, the question that had sparked so much of my reflection still lingered. Were we wrong to start eating without her? It wasn't an easy question to answer. On one hand, the decision had been practical. 11 people, including a sleeping baby, couldn't wait forever for one person, no matter how much we wanted everyone at the table. But on the other hand, her absence and the hurt it caused made me question whether practicality should have outweighed everything else. I thought about all the factors that had led to that moment. The reminders, the silence from her room, the frantic energy of hosting. At the time, it felt like there was no other choice. But in hindsight, could we have paused for another 10 or 15 minutes? Could we have gone upstairs one last time to make sure she knew how important it was for her to join us? Maybe. At the same time, her frustration wasn't entirely fair either. She had been given so many chances, so many reminders. It wasn't as if we'd left her out deliberately. Yet, feelings don't always follow logic. For her, the decision to eat without her wasn't just about timing. It was about what it represented. That realization helped me see that this wasn't about assigning blame, but about understanding how our actions affected each other. In the end, I decided the answer wasn't black and white. Yes, we could have handled things better. But no, we weren't wrong in the sense of being malicious or thoughtless. Families are complicated, and sometimes, even with the best intentions, we make choices that don't land the way we hope. The real question, I realized, wasn't about whether we were wrong. It was about what we'd do differently next time to make sure everyone felt seen and valued. And that felt like the better question to ask. As I sat down to write my reflections on the Thanksgiving that was anything but perfect, I realized how much the day had taught me, not just about my family, but about myself. Holidays are supposed to be about togetherness, yet they have a way of highlighting the cracks in relationships, the places where communication falters and expectations clash. This Thanksgiving had been a stark reminder of that, but also an opportunity to grow. The biggest takeaway for me was the importance of understanding. It's easy to get caught up in our own perspectives, to justify our actions based on what feels right in the moment. But being part of a family means considering the other person's feelings, even when they don't align with our own. My sister's frustration wasn't just about missing dinner. It was about feeling unseen, a feeling that likely went beyond that one evening. Recognizing that didn't erase the tension, but it gave me a way forward. I also learned that no matter how much effort you put into making a holiday perfect, perfection isn't the point. The table can be beautifully set, the food can be amazing, and yet things can still go wrong. And that's okay. What matters is how you respond, how you show up for your family even when things aren't ideal. For us, the real work began after the meal was over, in the quiet moments of reflection and the small steps toward mending what had frayed. As the weekend ended, I felt a cautious sense of optimism. My sister and I weren't fully resolved, but we'd taken a step in the right direction. The text exchange we'd shared was small, but it mattered. It reminded me that no conflict is permanent if both people are willing to meet halfway. Thanksgiving wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was real, messy, and full of lessons I hadn't expected to learn. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made it meaningful. Because in the end, family isn't about getting it right all the time. It's about showing up, trying again, and finding your way back to each other.